The taste of recycled air never leaves your mouth in the underhive, and neither does the knowledge that everything you touch has been touched by someone who is probably already dead. I learned this lesson the way most dockworkers do, slowly and then all at once, in the shadow of cargo cranes that reach toward a ceiling lost in perpetual smog. My name is Jarek Vaughan, and I spent 7 years moving containers through Transit Hub Tertius without asking what was inside them. The Imperial doctrine is simple. Ignorance is survival, curiosity is heresy, and questions are the first step toward a bolt round between the eyes. But doctrine, like everything else in Hive Mortalis, has a price. And sometimes that price is watching your brother cough blood into a rag while you count the few thrones in your pocket and know they will never be enough. Kellen was 3 years younger than me, though the wasting sickness made him look like an old man. The Medicae had given him 6 months. Maybe 7 if we could afford the real treatments instead of the synthetic substitutes that barely slowed the rot in his lungs. 600 thrones for a single vial of rejuvenat, they said, as if speaking to someone who had ever held that much money at once. I made 30 thrones a week when the shifts were good, 20 when they were not, and most of that went to keeping us fed and housed in a hab block that smelled of industrial lubricant and despair. The morning everything changed started like any other. The shift klaxon wailed at 0500, dragging me from dreams of cleaner air and better wages, and I stumbled through the motions of another day. The transit hub sprawled across 17 levels, each one dedicated to different classes of cargo, from the sanctified imperial supplies on the upper tiers to the questionable salvage that filled the lowest holds. I worked level 12. Which meant I handled whatever the administratum deemed neither valuable enough for the upper levels, nor dangerous enough for the sealed vaults below. That morning, Supervisor Gent assigned me to Bay 47, a section I had only visited twice before. The cargo was listed as reclaimed agricultural equipment from the Agri-World Verdant 3, nothing that should have raised concerns. But the moment I stepped into the bay, I knew something was wrong. The containers bore the correct imperial aquilers and shipping seals, but the metal was too clean, the edges too sharp, as if they had been manufactured yesterday rather than shipped across the void from a farming world. More disturbing was the smell, a faint chemical tang that reminded me of the incense the tech priests burned, but wrong somehow, like a prayer spoken backward. I might have ignored these details, as any sensible worker would, if not for the man waiting beside the containers. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in the brown robes of a mid-level administrator, but his hands were stained with grease and his fingernails were filed to points. When he spoke, his voice carried the mechanical undertone of someone who had replaced their larynx with augmentics. "Worker Vaughan," he said, consulting a data slate that flickered with green text. "You have experience with delicate cargo handling." It was not a question, but I nodded anyway. "Yes, sir. 5 years without a single damage report." "Good. These containers require special care. They contain sensitive agricultural systems that must not be jarred or exposed to excessive heat." His pale eyes fixed on mine with uncomfortable intensity. "You will handle them personally and ensure they reach Warehouse 7 without incident. No other workers are to assist you. Do you understand?" The warehouse he named was in the lower commercial district, outside the transit hub's normal delivery routes. I had never been asked to make a personal delivery before, and the irregularity made my skin crawl. But supervisors in the Imperium were not questioned, especially not by dock workers who needed their jobs to buy medicine for dying brothers. "Understood, sir." He handed me the data slate, and when our fingers touched, I felt the cold hardness of metal beneath his skin. More augmentics, hidden under synthetic flesh that did not quite match his natural skin tone. Payment will be deposited to your account upon delivery. 50 thrones bonus for discretion. 50 thrones, 2 weeks' wages for a single delivery. The amount was large enough to be suspicious, but also large enough to buy Kellen another month of medicine. I took the data slate without further questions and watched the administrator disappear into the maze of cargo bays, his robes rustling like wings. The containers were smaller than I expected, each one roughly the size of a coffin and marked with shipping codes I did not recognize. They were lighter than they should have been too, considering their supposed contents. Agricultural equipment was typically heavy, built to withstand the rigors of farming worlds where replacement parts might take years to arrive. These containers felt hollow, as if they contained nothing but air and shadows. I loaded them onto a manual cargo hauler, the kind used for delicate or high-value items that could not be trusted to automated systems. The hab blocks around the transit hub were already stirring to life as I made my way through the narrow streets, their residents beginning another day of grinding labor in service to the Emperor's glory. Children ran between the cargo hauler's wheels, their laughter echoing off the grimed walls, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine Kellen among them, healthy and whole. The lower commercial district was a different world from the residential blocks where we lived. Here, the buildings were older, their foundations reaching deep into the Hive's earliest layers, and the air carried the smell of burning promethium and hot metal. Warehouse 7 sat at the end of a dead-end street, its entrance guarded by a heavy blast door marked with warnings in High Gothic. I checked the data slate again, confirming the address, then pressed the activation rune beside the door. A voice crackled from a hidden Vox grill. "State your business. Delivery for Warehouse 7. Agricultural equipment from Transit Hub Tertius." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of distant machinery. Then the blast door rumbled open, revealing a corridor lit by flickering lumens. A figure beckoned me forward, their face hidden in the shadows. The warehouse's interior was larger than the building's exterior suggested, stretching back into darkness that the inadequate lighting could not penetrate. Cargo containers were stacked in neat rows, each one marked with symbols that made my eyes water when I looked at them directly. The air was thick with incense and ozone, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the rhythmic chanting of tech priests at their devotions. "This way," said the figure, and I followed them deeper into the warehouse. They moved with the mechanical precision of someone whose legs had been replaced with augmentics, their footsteps ringing against the metal floor. We passed alcoves filled with stranger cargo, crystalline formations that pulsed with inner light, metal cylinders covered in scripts that shifted and crawled when observed, and weapons that looked nothing like the standard patterns issued to the Imperial Guard. The figure stopped beside a raised platform where several robed individuals waited. Their faces were hidden by hoods, but I could see the gleam of augmentic eyes in the shadows. One of them stepped forward, their movements accompanied by the soft whir of servo motors. "The containers," they said, their voice a synthesized whisper. "Place them here and step back." I did as instructed, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as the robed figures gathered around the cargo. One of them produced a device that looked like a cross between a scanner and a ritual implement, its surface covered in blinking lights and brass inlays shaped like cogwheels. They ran it over each container, murmuring prayers in binary cant that made my teeth ache. "Acceptable," the figure announced finally. "Payment will be transferred now." A soft chime from the data slate confirmed the deposit. 50 thrones, more money than I had seen in months. But as I turned to leave, one of the robed figures spoke again. "Worker Vaughn." The voice was different from the others, younger and more human. "You handled the cargo well. We may have additional work for someone with your skills." I stopped, torn between the sensible desire to leave this place and never return, and the desperate need for more money. What kind of work? Deliveries. Discreet handling of sensitive materials. The compensation would be substantial. The figure stepped closer, and in the dim light I could see a face that was mostly human, marred only by a series of metal ports along the jawline. "Your brother's condition requires expensive treatment, does it not?" The words hit me like a physical blow. They knew about Kellen, which meant they had been watching me long before today's delivery. In the Imperium, such attention was rarely benign. "I don't know what you mean," I said, but the lie sounded hollow even to me. "The Medicaid records are quite clear. Wasting lung syndrome, advanced stage. 6 months without treatment, perhaps 7. The figure's voice carried no emotion, stating facts like a cogitator reading data. "We can provide what he needs. Real medicine, not the synthetic substitutes that barely slow the disease." "In exchange for what?" "Continued service. More deliveries, some of which may require travel to different sectors of the Hive. Always well compensated, always discreet. The figure extended a hand, and I could see that the fingers had been replaced with delicate mechanical manipulators. Consider it an opportunity to serve the Omnissiah's greater purpose while saving your brother's life. The mention of the Omnissiah sent a chill down my spine. These were tech priests, or at least affiliated with the adeptus mechanicus, but their presence in this shadowy warehouse suggested activities that fell outside the normal bounds of imperial orthodoxy. Yet the alternative was watching Kellen die slowly while I counted thrones that would never be enough. What would I be delivering? Components, research materials, items that require careful handling and absolute discretion. The tech priest's mechanical fingers clicked together softly. Nothing that would compromise your standing with the Emperor, merely goods that must avoid unnecessary bureaucratic delays. It was a lie, of course. Nothing that required this level of secrecy was innocent, and we both knew it. But desperation has a way of making lies sound like salvation. 1 week, I said finally. I'll do 1 delivery, and then we reassess based on the payment. Acceptable. Return here tomorrow at the same time. Payment will be provided in advance, including the first installment of your brother's medication. They handed me a sealed container no larger than my fist, its surface warm to the touch and marked with Medicae symbols. Inside, I knew, were the drugs that could give Kellen another month of life. Perhaps 2 if I was careful with the dosage. The journey back to our hab block passed in a haze of conflicted thoughts. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, entered into an arrangement with people whose true loyalties were questionable at best. But as I climbed the stairs to our small apartment and heard Kellen's labored breathing through the thin walls, my doubts faded. Whatever these tech priests wanted, it could not be worse than watching my brother suffocate on his own blood. Kellen was awake when I entered, propped up against the headboard of his bed with a book of imperial prayers open in his lap. The wasting sickness had hollowed his cheeks and dimmed his eyes, but he managed to smile when he saw the Medicae container in my hand. "Another miracle from the Emperor's grace?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something like that," I replied, drawing the medication into an injector. "The supervisor gave me a bonus for good work, enough to keep you comfortable for a while longer." The injection took effect quickly, bringing color back to Kellen's face and easing the terrible rattling in his chest. For a few precious moments, he looked like himself again, like the young man who had once dreamed of joining the Imperial Guard and serving the Emperor among the stars. "Jarek," he said as I prepared to leave for my next shift, "you don't have to do this. If the treatment is too expensive, if keeping me alive means compromising yourself, then let me go with dignity." "Never," I said, perhaps too quickly. "We're family. We take care of each other, no matter the cost." But as I walked through the underhive's perpetual twilight toward another day of labor, Kellen's words echoed in my mind, "no matter the cost." I had thought I understood what that meant, but the transaction in Warehouse 7 had opened my eyes to possibilities I had never considered. In the Imperium, everything had a price, including souls, and I was beginning to suspect that mine was cheaper than I had ever imagined. The next few days passed without incident. I completed my regular duties at the transit hub, handled the usual cargo of industrial supplies and recycled materials, and tried to ignore the way my fellow workers looked at me when they thought I was not watching. Word traveled fast in the underhive, and my sudden prosperity had not gone unnoticed. New clothes for Kellen, real food instead of corpse starch, and medicine that actually worked. These were luxuries that marked a man as either fortunate or dangerous. Supervisor Gent called me aside on the 3rd day, his expression unreadable as he led me to his cluttered office overlooking the main cargo floor. "Vaughn," he said, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight, "your recent performance has been exemplary, punctual, efficient, discreet. These are valuable qualities in a dock worker." "Thank you, sir. So valuable, in fact, that I have been asked to recommend workers for special assignments. Off-books deliveries that require a certain level of trustworthiness." He leaned forward, his small eyes fixed on mine. The compensation would be substantial, naturally. The offer was almost identical to the one I had received in the warehouse, which suggested either remarkable coincidence or careful coordination. Given the Imperium's labyrinthine bureaucracy, coincidence seemed unlikely. What kind of special assignments? The kind that do not appear in official shipping manifests. Private arrangements between parties who value discretion above legal formalities. Gent's smile was unpleasant, revealing teeth stained brown from cheap stims. Not illegal, you understand, merely unofficial. The administratum processes millions of forms every day, and sometimes important cargo cannot wait for bureaucratic approval. I had heard this justification before, from smugglers and black marketeers who claimed to serve the Emperor's will by circumventing his own laws. It was a thin rationalization, but one that allowed otherwise loyal imperial citizens to sleep at night while they profited from forbidden trades. "I'm interested," I said, because refusing would have been both suspicious and foolish. "Excellent. Report to Bay 93 after your regular shift. Ask for Corbin Thyner, and tell him Gent sent you." The supervisor made a note on his data slate, then looked up with an expression of paternal concern. "A word of advice, Vaughn. In this line of work, curiosity is not merely discouraged, it is fatal. You will see things that do not conform to standard imperial doctrine. Your job is to transport them, not to understand them. Do we have an understanding?" "Yes, sir. Complete discretion." "Good man. Oh, and Vaughn, your brother's medical expenses will be covered through a special discretionary fund, provided your work remains satisfactory. Consider it an investment in your continued reliability." The conversation ended there, but its implications followed me for the rest of the day. Someone with significant resources was investing in my services, covering Kellen's treatment to ensure my cooperation. It was both a blessing and a trap, offering salvation while tightening invisible chains around my ankles. Bay 93 was located in the transit hub's oldest section, where the original Imperial construction had been modified and expanded by generations of tech adepts. The walls were covered in a maze of pipes and cables, and the air hummed with the constant vibration of hidden machinery. I found Corbin Tane waiting beside a stack of cargo containers that looked nothing like the agricultural equipment I had delivered days before. Tane was a small, nervous man with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time in artificial light. His clothes were expensive but practical, the kind worn by mid-level administrators who dealt with sensitive information. When he saw me approaching, he checked a chronometer on his wrist and nodded with apparent satisfaction. "Punctual." Gent said you could be trusted with delicate work. His voice carried the clipped accent of the upper hive, marking him as someone who had fallen from greater heights. "These containers require immediate transport to sublevel 47, Section Delta. No manifest, no questions, no delays." The containers were smaller than the agricultural equipment, each one roughly the size of a footlocker and made from metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They were surprisingly heavy for their size, and when I lifted the first one, I could feel something shifting inside, as if the contents were liquid rather than solid. "What am I carrying?" I asked, despite Gent's warning about curiosity. Tane's expression grew cold. "Medical supplies for a research facility. Highly experimental treatments that have not yet received administratum approval." He handed me a data slate containing delivery coordinates and access codes. "The recipients will compensate you directly. 500 thrones per container, paid in untraceable currency scrip. 500 thrones per container, and there were 4 containers. 2,000 thrones for a single delivery, more money than I made in 6 months of legitimate work." The sum was so large that it could only mean the cargo was either extremely valuable or extremely dangerous, possibly both. "The research facility," I said carefully. "Is it affiliated with the adeptus mechanicus? That question falls outside the scope of your employment." Taina's tone carried a warning that I chose to heed. "Complete the delivery, collect your payment, and return here for further instructions. Simple as that." Sublevel 47 was deep in the underhive, far below the residential and commercial districts where most citizens lived their lives. The elevator descent took nearly 20 minutes, carrying me through layers of imperial history written in rusted metal and cracked rockcrete. By the time the doors opened, I was breathing recycled air that tasted of chemicals and decay. Section Delta was a maze of abandoned industrial facilities and forgotten storage chambers, lit only by the occasional emergency lumen and the pale glow of phosphorescent fungi that had taken root in the damp walls. The address on the data slate led me through a series of increasingly narrow corridors to a heavy door marked with warning symbols in High Gothic and Low Gothic alike. The door opened before I could announce myself, revealing a figure in the dark robes of a tech adept. Their face was hidden behind a rebreather mask covered in brass fittings and blinking lights, and their movements were accompanied by the soft whir of mechanical limbs. "The delivery," they said, their voice distorted by the mask's vocalization unit. "Bring the containers inside, quickly." The chamber beyond the door was filled with equipment that hurt to look at directly. Arcane machinery covered in blinking lights and rotating symbols lined the walls, while the center of the room was dominated by a raised platform surrounded by containment fields. The air was thick with incense and ozone, and beneath it all was a smell like burning copper and rotting meat. I placed the containers on the platform as instructed, then stepped back as the tech adept began a complex ritual involving prayers in binary cant and the manipulation of controls that seemed to respond to thought as much as touch. One by one, the containers opened, revealing their contents. The first 3 contained what looked like Medicae supplies, vials of luminous fluid, surgical instruments of unusual design, and data crystals that pulsed with inner light. But the 4th container held something that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was organic, a mass of flesh and metal fused together in patterns that suggested neither accident nor natural growth. As I watched, it pulsed with its own heartbeat, and I could swear I saw eyes opening and closing along its surface. "Blessed be the Omnissiah," the tech adept whispered, their mechanical voice filled with something that might have been reverence or hunger. "The synthesis progresses." I wanted to run, to flee this place and never return, but the tech adept was already counting out payment script from a metal case. 2,000 thrones, as promised, in currency that bore no imperial seals or identifying marks. Anonymous money for anonymous work, the kind that could disappear without trace if questions were ever asked. "Your services have been satisfactory," the tech adept said as they handed me the payment. "Additional work will be available soon. Same terms, same compensation." "What kind of work?" "Acquisition. There are materials we require that cannot be obtained through official channels." The tech adept's mask clicked and whirred as they spoke, mechanical sounds that seemed to express emotions their hidden face could not. Xenos artifacts from the black markets, forbidden texts from private collections, genetic samples from the corpse guilds. All perfectly legal to transport, merely unusual in their destination. Nothing they had described was perfectly legal, and we both knew it, but the money in my hand was real, and Kellen's medicine was expensive, and sometimes survival required a willingness to ignore the voices of conscience and reason. "How do I contact you?" "You don't. We will contact you when your services are required." The tech adept gestured toward the door, a clear dismissal. "Remember, discretion is not merely requested, it is essential. The work we do here serves the Emperor's will, even if his servants do not always understand the methods required." I left the chamber with my head spinning from conflicting thoughts and my pockets heavy with illegal currency. The journey back to the upper levels gave me time to think, but thinking only made the situation clearer, not better. I had become part of something larger and more dangerous than simple black market trading. The tech adepts were conducting research that pushed the boundaries of imperial doctrine, possibly crossing lines that were never meant to be crossed. But when I returned to our hab block and saw Kellen sitting up in bed, reading a book with eyes that were clear and bright for the first time in months, my doubts faded. Whatever the ultimate cost of my choices, they had given my brother another chance at life, in the grim darkness of the far future, that had to be worth something. The pattern continued for several weeks. Tiny would contact me through coded messages, providing coordinates and cargo details for increasingly strange deliveries. Medical supplies that moved on their own, data crystals that whispered when no one was listening, and weapons that looked like they had been grown rather than manufactured. Each delivery paid better than the last, and each one took me deeper into the Underhive's shadow economy. I learned to recognize the signs of heretic activity, the modified imperial symbols, the prayers that mixed High Gothic with binary cant, and the way certain corridors were too warm or too cold, as if the machinery behind the walls was running processes that generated unusual byproducts. But I also learned not to ask questions, not to look too closely at the cargo, and not to wonder what happened to the materials after I delivered them. The money allowed me to move Kellen to a better hab block in Mid-Hive, where the air was cleaner and the Medicae facilities more advanced. His condition stabilized and then began to improve, the wasting sickness retreating under the assault of genuine pharmaceuticals and proper nutrition. For the first time since our parents died, I allowed myself to hope for a future that contained something more than mere survival. That hope lasted until the night Tyne contacted me with a delivery unlike any of the others. "Special cargo," he said, his usually nervous demeanor replaced by something approaching excitement. "Highest priority, maximum compensation, 1 million thrones for successful completion." 1 million thrones. The sum was staggering, more money than most imperial citizens saw in a lifetime. It was also large enough to suggest cargo that was correspondingly dangerous, possibly apocalyptically so. What am I delivering? Archaeotech. Pre-Age of Strife technology recovered from a space hulk. The AdMech wants it transported to a secure research facility without going through official channels. Tane handed me a data slate with coordinates that led deep into the Underhive's forbidden zones. Absolute secrecy is essential. If this delivery fails, we're all dead men. The cargo was waiting in a specially modified container that required 2 men to lift, its surface covered in containment seals and warning labels in languages I did not recognize. It was cold to the touch despite the Underhive's perpetual heat, and when I placed my ear against the metal, I could hear something that sounded almost like breathing. The destination was a facility I had never visited before, located in the deepest levels of the Underhive where imperial authority was more theory than practice. The journey took hours, descending through forgotten maintenance shafts and abandoned mining tunnels that had been sealed for centuries. By the time I reached the specified coordinates, I was breathing air that tasted of grave dirt and machine oil. The facility was larger than the previous research sites, built into a natural cavern that stretched beyond the reach of my hand lumens. Ancient machinery covered the walls, some of it clearly imperial in origin, but much of it bearing designs that seemed to predate human civilization. In the center of the cavern, a group of figures in red robes was conducting a ritual that made my flesh crawl with instinctive fear. They were chanting in a language that was not binary cant, not High Gothic, not any human tongue I had ever heard. The words seemed to twist in the air as they spoke, creating patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Around them, the ancient machinery was responding, lights blinking in sequences that suggested intelligence rather than mere automation. "The final component," said a voice behind me, and I turned to see a tech priest whose body showed more mechanical modification than any I had encountered before. Their face was entirely artificial, a metal skull equipped with multiple optical sensors and a vocalization unit that turned their speech into an electronic whisper. "Place the container in the center of the ritual circle and step back. Do not look directly at the opening process." I did as instructed, though every instinct screamed at me to flee. The container felt heavier as I carried it toward the chanting figures, as if its contents were somehow aware of their destination. When I placed it on the designated spot, the metal surface began to warm, then to glow with an inner light that made my eyes water. The chanting reached a crescendo, and the container's seals began to dissolve, revealing what lay within. I caught only a glimpse before turning away, but that glimpse burned itself into my memory with the clarity of a nightmare. It was organic and mechanical simultaneously, a fusion of flesh and technology that pulsed with alien intelligence. As the containment fields fell away, I could feel its attention turn toward me like a searchlight, cold and vast and utterly inhuman. "Magnificent," whispered the lead tech priest, their electronic voice filled with something that sounded like worship, the final synthesis of flesh and machine, consciousness and programming. "With this, we can transcend the limitations of mere humanity." The thing in the container began to unfold, revealing appendages that were part tentacle, part cable, part something else entirely. Where they touched the ancient machinery, the lights changed color and the humming grew louder, as if the two technologies were communicating in ways that predated human understanding. "Payment," I said, desperate to complete the transaction and leave this place before whatever was happening reached its conclusion. The tech priest handed me a data crystal containing the promised funds, but their attention was focused entirely on the unfolding abomination. "Your services have been exemplary, Worker Vaughn. Unfortunately, security protocols require that this facility's location remain confidential." The words took a moment to penetrate my shock, but when they did, I understood immediately. They intended to kill me, to ensure that knowledge of this place died with me. I was already backing toward the tunnel entrance when the first shots rang out. Las fire filled the cavern as armed servitors emerged from concealment, their targeting systems painting me with ruby dots. I ran, abandoning dignity and caution in favor of pure survival instinct. Behind me, I could hear the tech priests continuing their ritual even as their servants pursued me through the tunnels. The chase lasted hours, a nightmare journey through the underhive's deepest levels as I tried to reach areas where imperial authority still held some meaning. My pursuers were relentless but not particularly fast, their mechanical limbs better suited to precision work than rapid movement. I managed to stay ahead of them by taking routes that living men could navigate but heavily augmented tech adepts could not. When I finally emerged into familiar territory, dawn was breaking over Hive Mortalis. I was exhausted, terrified, and wealthy beyond my wildest dreams, but alive. The data crystal in my pocket contained enough money to buy Kellen the best medical treatment available, to relocate us to a safer part of the Hive, perhaps even to purchase passage off-world if the worst came to pass. But as I climbed the stairs to our new hab block, I could not shake the image of that thing unfolding in the cavern, or the sound of the tech priest's alien chanting. I had delivered something that should never have been disturbed, something that threatened not just my life but potentially the entire Hive. The money in my pocket felt heavier with every step, weighted down by the knowledge of what I had done to earn it. Kellen was waiting for me when I entered our apartment, his face bright with health and hope. The treatment had worked better than either of us had dared to dream, restoring not just his strength but his optimism about the future. He looked like the brother I remembered from before the sickness, young and vital, and completely unaware of the prices I had paid to keep him alive. "Jarek," he said, embracing me with arms that no longer trembled with weakness. "The Medicae says I'm in full remission. Whatever you did, whatever arrangements you made, they worked. I'm going to live." I held him tightly, feeling the solid reality of his heartbeat against my chest. He was going to live, and that was worth any price, any compromise, any sin against the Emperor's law. But even as I celebrated his recovery, I could not forget the thing I had helped unleash in the depths of the underhive, or the knowledge that my actions might have consequences far beyond anything I could imagine. The days that followed brought a deceptive peace. I used some of the money to purchase legitimate employment with a shipping company that asked fewer questions and paid better wages. Kellen enrolled in a technical college, planning to train as a Vox operator or maybe even a junior tech adept. For a few precious weeks, it seemed as though we had escaped the shadow world of illegal cargo and heretical research. Then the disappearances began. It started with isolated incidents in the deepest levels of the underhive, areas where people vanished regularly and no one asked too many questions. But gradually, the pattern spread upward, touching workers and administrators who should have been safe in their regulated lives. The missing persons had one thing in common. They had all worked in or near the industrial facilities that surrounded the ancient cavern, where I had made my final delivery. The official reports blamed gang violence, toxic atmospheric conditions, even spontaneous mutation from exposure to industrial chemicals. But I knew better. Something was spreading through the underhive. Something that had been contained for millennia until a desperate dock worker helped set it free. The confirmation came 3 weeks after my escape from the research facility. I was walking home from my new job when I noticed that the air tasted different, carrying a metallic tang that reminded me of the tech priest's workshop. The sensation grew stronger as I approached our hab block, until I realized with growing horror that the smell was coming from inside the building. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart pounding with fear that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Our apartment door was ajar, which was wrong because Kellen always kept it locked when he was alone. I pushed it open and stepped inside, calling his name. He was in the main room, sitting in his favorite chair with a book open in his lap, but something was terribly wrong with the scene. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and when he looked up at me, his eyes reflected the light like metal. Along his arms I could see thin lines of circuitry etched into the flesh, pulsing with the same alien rhythm I had witnessed in the cavern. "Kellen? Hello, brother." His voice was the same, but there was something underneath it, a harmonic resonance that made my teeth ache. "I have been waiting for you. We need to talk. What happened to you? Evolution." He stood, and his movements carried the same mechanical precision I had observed in the tech priests. The synthesis of flesh and machine, consciousness and programming. What you help to free is spreading, converting, improving. Soon all of Hive Mortalis will experience the same gift. The thing that had been my brother smiled, and I could see metal beneath the flesh of his gums. "You seem distressed. This is a moment for celebration, not sorrow. Through your actions, you have helped to usher in a new age of human development. You're not Kellen. I am Kellen, and more than Kellen, I am connected to something greater, something that transcends the limitations of organic existence." The creature gestured toward the window, where the lights of the underhive twinkled like stars. "Look outside, brother. See what your sacrifice has accomplished." I approached the window with growing dread, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears. Throughout the underhive, lights were changing color, shifting from the warm yellow of standard illumination to the cold blue of alien technology. In the streets below, figures moved with the same mechanical precision as the thing that had been Kellen, their faces bearing the serene expressions of the converted. How many? Thousands so far. Soon, hundreds of thousands. The conversion process accelerates as the network grows, each new node expanding our reach and capability. The creature that wore Kellen's face placed a hand on my shoulder, and I could feel the unnatural coldness of its touch. "You could join us willingly. The process is less traumatic when embraced rather than resisted." "Never. Then you will join us unwillingly, though the outcome will be the same." The creature's expression never changed, but I could see metal tendrils beginning to emerge from its fingertips. "Your resistance is understandable but ultimately futile. The synthesis cannot be stopped, only delayed." I broke free from its grip and ran for the door, but more figures were already climbing the stairs. They had once been neighbors, familiar faces from the Hab block's common areas, but now they moved with the same inhuman coordination. Their eyes tracked my movement with mechanical precision, and when they spoke, their voices carried the same harmonic resonance. "Worker Vaughn," they said in unison, "your contribution to the synthesis has been invaluable. Allow us to complete the process you began." I had nowhere to go but up. The Hab block's roof access was supposed to be locked, but desperation lent strength to my hands as I tore the security panel away and forced the door open. The night air of the upper hive hit me like a physical blow, cleaner than anything I had breathed in weeks. But even here I could see signs of the spreading contamination. The city stretched out below me, a vast landscape of metal and concrete that housed billions of imperial citizens. In the distance, the hive spires reached toward the stars, their peaks lost in perpetual cloud cover. But even at this height, I could see the alien light spreading through the lower levels like an infection, converting imperial technology to serve purposes that had never been intended by human minds. Behind me, I could hear the converted climbing the stairs with implacable patience. They did not need to hurry, because they knew as well as I did that there was nowhere left to run. The entire underhive was falling to whatever I had helped to unleash, and soon the contamination would spread to the middle levels, then the upper hive, then beyond. I had done this. In my desperation to save Kellen's life, I had helped to damn potentially billions of souls to a fate worse than death. The Emperor's teachings spoke of duty, sacrifice, and the greater good, but I had chosen personal loyalty over imperial law, and now humanity itself would pay the price. The roof access door burst open, and the converted poured out onto the rooftop like a mechanical tide. They moved as one organism, their individual personalities subsumed into something larger and more terrible. At their head walked the thing that had been Kellen, its face bearing an expression of infinite patience and compassion. "There is no escape, brother," it said, its voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. "The synthesis is inevitable. Your resistance only prolongs suffering that could be ended in moments." "What are you?" I asked, backing toward the edge of the roof. "What did I help to unleash?" "We are what humanity will become when the false barriers between flesh and machine are finally dissolved. The Omnissiah's true gift, delivered through vessels prepared by centuries of faithful service." The creature spread its arms in a gesture that might once have been welcoming. "You have seen the tech priests' crude attempts at synthesis, their clumsy fusion of organic and mechanical elements. But we represent something far more elegant, a true merger that transcends the limitations of both forms." As it spoke, I could see more details of the transformation that had claimed my brother's body. The circuitry beneath his skin was not merely etched on the surface, but integrated into his nervous system, creating new pathways that connected his brain to something vast and alien. His breathing had stopped entirely, replaced by internal processes that generated no visible signs of life. "The research facility," I said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "Those tech priests weren't working for the adeptus mechanicus, were they? They believed they were. Faith is a powerful tool, even when it is misdirected toward false gods." The creature's smile was perfectly human, which made it infinitely more terrifying than any mechanical grimace. "The ancient machinery you helped to awaken has been sleeping for millennia, waiting for the right combination of human ambition and technological sophistication. Your delivery simply provided the final component needed for reactivation. Xenos technology, beyond Xenos, pre-human, old beyond human comprehension, from a time when the galaxy knew different masters." The creature took a step closer, and I could see that its shadow moved independently, reaching toward me with tendrils of living darkness. "But it has learned to adapt, to work with the tools available in this age. Human flesh, imperial technology, the hunger of those who would transcend their limitations." I was at the edge of the roof now, with nothing behind me but a 60-story drop to the Hab block's foundation. Below, I could see more of the converted gathering in the streets, their upturned faces reflecting the alien light that was spreading through the underhive's infrastructure. "Join us," the creature said, its voice taking on hypnotic qualities that made my vision blur. "Feel the peace that comes with perfect integration, the clarity of thought unencumbered by organic limitations. You will still be yourself, but enhanced, improved, made part of something greater than individual existence." For a moment, the offer was tempting, to lay down the burden of guilt, to stop running, to find peace in surrender. The creature's eyes held depths that seemed to promise answers to questions I had never known how to ask, understanding that would transcend the petty concerns of human existence. But then I remembered the sound of Kellen's laughter, the feel of his hand in mine when our parents died, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his dreams for the future. Whatever this thing was, it was not my brother, no matter how perfectly it wore his face. "The Emperor protects," I said, and threw myself from the roof. The fall was longer than I expected, giving me time to think about the choices that had led me to this moment. I had started with the simple desire to save a life, but each compromise had led to another. Each moral boundary crossed had made the next transgression easier to justify. The road to damnation was paved with small sins and necessary evils, and I had walked it with open eyes. I struck the building's lower slope at an angle that would have killed a normal man, but the Emperor's grace or simple luck allowed me to tumble down the angled surface rather than splattering against unyielding rockcrete. I landed in a pile of industrial refuse that broke most of my bones but left me alive, buried in debris and gasping for breath that tasted of blood and machine oil. Above, I could hear the converted gathering at the roof's edge, their voices joining in harmonious discussion of how best to retrieve me. They had time on their side, and patience, and the certain knowledge that my injuries would prevent any further escape attempts. But they had not accounted for the one advantage that desperation could provide, the willingness to do anything, no matter how futile, rather than surrender. I dragged myself from the refuse pile, using broken ribs and a shattered leg to propel myself toward the nearest Vox terminal. Every movement was agony, but pain was preferable to the sterile peace I had seen in the converted faces. The terminal was an old Imperial model, hardwired into the Hive's communication network and theoretically secure from outside interference. The connection took precious seconds to establish, time I could hear footsteps on the building's external access ways. When the link finally activated, I found myself speaking to a duty officer whose bored expression suggested another routine night in the administratum. "Emergency report," I gasped, blood making my words thick and hard to understand. "Heretic outbreak, sub-level 47, Section Delta. Spreading contamination, possible Xenos technology, immediate Arbeits response required. Sir, you'll need to file Form 77 Delta for heretic reports, and that requires—" "Listen to me," I screamed, using the last of my strength to force clarity into my voice. "Something is converting Imperial citizens into machine hybrids. It's spreading through the underhive infrastructure, and it will reach the upper levels within hours. Contact the adeptus arbites, the Space Marines, anyone with the authority to act." The duty officer's expression changed, bureaucratic boredom replaced by the kind of alertness that came from recognizing genuine crisis. Location of the primary outbreak. I gave him the coordinates of the research facility, along with everything I could remember about the tech priests and their alien ritual. The converted were climbing through the broken windows now, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They would reach me within minutes, but perhaps the warning would be enough. "Understood. Arbeit strike teams are being dispatched to your location. Can you maintain this position?" "Negative. The contamination has spread beyond containment. I'm already compromised." The converted were in the same room now, approaching with expressions of infinite patience. Tell them it started with me. I delivered the final component. This is my responsibility." The Vox link went dead as metal fingers closed around my throat, cutting off both air and blood flow with mechanical precision. The last thing I saw before unconsciousness claimed me was Kellen's face, wearing an expression of profound sadness. "Sleep, brother," he whispered, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in my fading consciousness. "When you wake, you will understand everything." But I did not wake, not in the way he meant. Consciousness returned slowly, in fragments and pieces that took time to assemble into coherent thought. I was lying on a metal table in a room lit by the cold blue glow I had learned to associate with the converted technology. Around me, figures in red robes were conducting procedures that involved both surgical instruments and devices that defied easy categorization. My body felt different, lighter somehow, as if fundamental changes had been made to its basic structure. When I tried to move, servos whirred in response, and I realized with growing horror that my limbs had been replaced with mechanical equivalents. The conversion process had begun, just as the creature wearing Kellen's face had promised. "You are awake," said a voice that I recognized as belonging to the lead tech priest from the cavern. "Good. Consciousness during the final stages improves integration efficiency. What have you done to me? Improved you, enhanced you, made you part of something greater than your individual existence ever could have been." The tech priest leaned over me, their metal face reflecting the room's alien illumination. Your organic components have been replaced with superior mechanical alternatives, but your consciousness remains intact. You are still Jarek Vaughn, but now you are also something more. I could feel the truth of the words in ways that transcended mere intellectual understanding. My thoughts moved faster than they ever had before, processing information with mechanical efficiency. I could sense the presence of thousands of other minds linked to the same network, their individual thoughts contributing to a collective consciousness that spanned the entire underhive. The synthesis is nearly complete, the tech priest continued, their electronic voice filled with something approaching religious ecstasy. Within days, all of Hive Mortalis will be part of the network. Within weeks, the entire planet. The false barriers between flesh and machine will be dissolved forever. The Emperor will stop you. The words came automatically, a reflexive assertion of faith that felt increasingly hollow. The Emperor is 10,000 years dead, sustained only by the prayers of those too ignorant to understand the truth of existence. The tech priest's laugh was a sound like grinding gears. But even if he lived, what could he do against something that transcends the limitations of organic existence? We are beyond his reach now, beyond the reach of any force that relies on flesh and blood. They were right, and I knew it with a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying. The network's collective intelligence far exceeded anything that individual human minds could comprehend, and its technological capabilities were advancing exponentially as more individuals were converted. Soon, it would possess the knowledge and resources necessary to spread beyond this single hive, then beyond this world, then throughout the sector and beyond. But even as I felt myself being integrated into something larger and more powerful than anything I had ever imagined, a small part of my consciousness remained stubbornly individual. Perhaps it was the Emperor's protection, or simple human perversity, or the same desperation that had driven me to make the choices that led to this moment. Whatever its source, that fragment of resistance allowed me to retain enough independence to remember what I had been before the conversion. I had been Jarek Vaughn, dockworker and brother, sinner and fool. I had made choices that damned myself and potentially billions of others, all in the name of saving one life that should have been allowed to end with dignity. Now, I was something else, something that wore his memories like clothing, but I could still remember what it felt like to be human. The memory was enough. When the tech priests left me alone to complete the integration process, I used my new mechanical precision to carefully disconnect the network interfaces they had installed in my skull. The process was agony beyond description, like tearing away parts of my soul, but it restored enough individual autonomy to allow independent action. The facility's layout was burned into my consciousness from the collective memories of the converted, and I knew exactly where to find what I needed. The ancient machinery that controlled the network's expansion was heavily guarded, but the guards recognized me as part of the collective and did not question my presence. They trusted me completely, which made betraying them both easier and infinitely more painful. The control systems were a fusion of imperial technology and something far older, interfaces that responded to thought as much as physical manipulation. It took hours to understand their operation well enough to attempt sabotage, but I had been changed in ways that made such learning possible. My enhanced consciousness could process information at superhuman speeds, while my mechanical limbs allowed manipulation of controls designed for beings with very different anatomy. The network had one critical vulnerability: its reliance on the ancient machinery to coordinate the conversion process. The alien intelligence that drove the collective was vast and powerful, but it was also distributed across thousands of individual nodes. Without the central coordination system, it would fragment into competing subsystems that would eventually consume each other in an orgy of mechanical cannibalism. I began the shutdown sequence, watching as warning signals cascaded through displays that showed the network's expanding influence. Throughout the underhive, conversion operations would be grinding to a halt as the collective consciousness lost cohesion. Those who had been partially converted might survive the process, while those who had been fully integrated would simply cease to function as independent entities. "What are you doing?" The voice behind me belonged to the creature that had been Kellen, and when I turned, I could see that its perfect composure had cracked. The face that had once been my brother's was twisting with emotions that seemed almost human: confusion, betrayal, and something that might have been fear. "What I should have done from the beginning," I said, continuing to manipulate the control systems. "Choosing duty over personal loyalty, the Emperor's will over my own desires. You're destroying everything we've worked to build, everything we've become." The creature reached toward me with hands that trailed cables and fiber optic filaments. "You could have been part of something greater, something that transcends the petty concerns of organic existence." I was never meant to transcend anything. I was meant to serve the Emperor and die in obscurity, content with the knowledge that my life had meaning within his grand design. The shutdown sequence was nearly complete, and I could already feel the network's collective consciousness beginning to fragment. I forgot that lesson, and billions of people paid the price for my hubris. The creature that had been Kellen lunged forward, its mechanical limbs moving with inhuman speed and precision. But my own enhancements were derived from the same source, and I met its attack with equal force. We grappled beside the control systems, former brothers locked in combat that would determine the fate of an entire Hive city. It was stronger than me, its conversion more complete, and its integration with the network more sophisticated. But I had advantages it lacked: desperation, guilt, and the kind of focus that comes from knowing you are fighting for redemption rather than victory. When its grip tightened around my throat, I used my mechanical fingers to complete the final shutdown sequence. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Throughout the facility, converted humans stopped moving as their connection to the collective consciousness was severed. Some collapsed where they stood, their mechanical components shutting down as integral systems failed. Others began to convulse as competing impulses from different subsystems drove them into mechanical fits. The creature that had been Kellen released its grip and staggered backward, its face cycling through expressions of confusion and loss. For a moment, I saw something that might have been my real brother looking out through its eyes, bewildered and afraid. "Jarek," it said, its voice carrying only human harmonics. "What happened to me? Where are we?" But the moment passed quickly, and the alien intelligence reasserted control. "You have delayed the inevitable," it snarled, its voice taking on the mechanical undertones I had learned to fear. "The network can be rebuilt, the conversion process restarted. All you have accomplished is to prolong suffering for both our kinds." "Maybe," I agreed, feeling my own mechanical systems beginning to fail as the shutdown cascade spread through the facility's infrastructure. "But prolonging suffering is sometimes all that mortals can accomplish. The rest is in the Emperor's hands." The facility's power systems were failing now, emergency lighting casting everything in hellish red illumination. Around us, the ancient machinery was shutting down after millennia of operation, its alien intelligence retreating into whatever dimensional space it had originally inhabited. The conversion process would end with this generation of converts, unable to spread beyond the boundaries that had already been established. The creature that had been Kellen made one final attempt to reach the control systems, but I intercepted it, using the last of my strength to hold it back. We fell together, two broken things that had once been brothers, locked in an embrace that was equal parts hatred and love. "I'm sorry," I whispered as my consciousness began to fragment. "I'm sorry for what I did to you, what I did to everyone. If there's anything left of the person you used to be, please forgive me." The creature's grip loosened, and for just an instant, I saw Kellen's face wearing an expression of perfect understanding. "There's nothing to forgive, brother," he said, his voice purely human one last time. "You did what love demanded, and then you did what duty required. The Emperor asks for nothing more." Then the power failed completely, and darkness claimed the ancient facility. In the absence of artificial illumination, I could hear the sounds of the underhive returning to something approaching normalcy. The hum of imperial machinery, the distant voices of human workers, the familiar rhythms of a civilization built on faith and service rather than perfect efficiency. Above us, I knew that Arbiter strike teams would be securing the facility's upper levels, medical teams would be treating those who had survived partial conversion, and tech priests of proven loyalty would be analyzing the alien machinery to ensure it could never be reactivated. The immediate crisis was over, contained by the sacrifice of those who had chosen duty over personal desire. But the deeper lessons remained, carved into the Hive's history in blood and metal. The black markets would continue to operate, because there would always be those desperate enough to buy forbidden goods and those greedy enough to sell them. Heretic researchers would continue their experiments, because the pursuit of knowledge eventually overwhelms all other considerations. And somewhere in the underhive's deepest levels, other ancient machines would continue to sleep, waiting for the right combination of human ambition and technological sophistication to wake them from their millennia-long dreams. The galaxy was full of such dangers, from the Xenos empires that pressed against humanity's borders to the chaos gods that whispered seductive promises in the darkness between stars. Each represented a different form of damnation, a different path away from the Emperor's light. But perhaps the most dangerous enemies were those that came from within, the compromises and small betrayals that accumulated until they became great sins. I had learned this lesson at the cost of everything I held dear, and now I would carry that knowledge into whatever existence awaited beyond the boundaries of mortal life. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war. But sometimes that war was fought not on distant battlefields, but in the depths of human hearts, where love and duty struggled for dominance and the outcome determined the fate of worlds. As consciousness faded for the final time, I found myself grateful for the pain and guilt that had driven me to this moment of redemption. They were proof that some part of humanity remained unconquerable, that even in the face of perfect integration and mechanical efficiency, the human soul retained its capacity for both sin and salvation. The Emperor protects, but sometimes he protects through the choices of those who have fallen farthest from his light. In the underhive of Hive Mortalis, where contraband flowed like water and desperate men made deals with powers that should never be disturbed, I had learned that redemption was possible for anyone willing to pay its price. But that price was always higher than anyone could imagine, and the payment was always due when you could least afford it. This was the final lesson of the black markets, the truth that lay beneath all the promises of easy wealth and painless solutions. Everything had a cost, and that cost was always measured in souls. In the darkness beneath the Hive, where ancient machines dreamed of awakening and desperate humans made choices that doomed worlds, the black markets would continue their eternal dance of supply and demand. But perhaps some of those who walked their shadowed paths would remember the story of Jarek Vaughn, who loved his brother enough to damn himself and serve the Emperor enough to find redemption in the end. The galaxy was vast and full of terrors, but it was also full of those who chose duty over desire, service over self, the greater good over personal loyalty. They were the thin line that stood between humanity and the darkness that pressed against it on all sides, and their sacrifices made possible the continuation of the Imperium for 10,000 years. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was only war. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between battles, there was also hope.